Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the Star of Christ Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 241 and we're giving a general overview of Ad Gentes, the document on missionary activity, and we're going to introduce Father Aaron Robert Wessman, who is part of an American missionary community, Glenmary Missionaries. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. So Vatican II has a whole bunch of documents, and we're taking them chronologically by publication date. Ad Gentes just means to the nations. Ad is to, and Gentes is nations or peoples. The subtitle here is on the missionary activity of the church. That gives us the theme very clearly. And then it was approved 2,394-5. So that is a very strong need, a very much unanimity of the bishops and things like that. So our guest today is Father Aaron Wessman. Father Aaron, nice to have you on the podcast.
Father Matthew, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I love the project that you've been engaging in, Vatican II in a Year. That's wonderful.
Excellent. So a little bit of introduction for Father Wessman. He is the first vice president or vicar general and director of formation for Glenmary Home Missioners. He has a PhD from Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, Systematic Theology, 2019. He serves as an at-large board member for the Conference of Major Superiors of Men, the CMSM. He's a guest lecturer at St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology in Indiana. And he's on the editorial board for the Review for Religious, and he's the author of The Church's Mission in a Polarized World. And he sometimes gives lectures and publishes on the theme of Christianity and polarization. And he serves in 2 prisons in the Cincinnati metro area. So hopefully that's a good summary of your biography here, Father Wessman.
Oh, that's great. Very generous. Thank you, Father Matthew.
So to introduce Ad Gentes, we have 4 main parts of the interview. And the first part is just going to be a bit on the history of the church's missionary activity from the apostolic age through what we talk about the great missionary activity of in colonization times and into the 20th century and even today. We're going to talk about some key themes in Ad Gentes. We're going to go over the chapters of Ad Gentes because as we're going to read it, it's helpful to have a brief summary of each chapter. And then we're going to talk about what the church has said about missionary activity since Vatican II. So very, very, very standard outline if you've been listening to this podcast for a while. The church has undergone an extensive series of stages of missionary activity. As I noted there's the apostolic age. Then you have being persecuted by the Romans. You have all those martyr stories. You have with Rome and imperial support. Then you have all these pagan barbarians. I know my ancestors many generations back would have classified in those as Germans or Scottish or Irish. And then you have worldwide. Now you have we're missionaries to a post-Christian world and missionaries to Protestants and things like that, bringing that back into the Catholics. And obviously this isn't perfectly sequential because some of the things, a lot of them overlap and things like that. So I just want to talk about a few of these ages. Obviously, you can't go in depth in all of them. Just before we're starting, Father Wessman's like, there's so much to say. This podcast could go several hours if we want it. So why don't you just start with the apostolic age, what we have in Acts, what we have in the gospel at the end, towards the end of the gospels, where Jesus is sending out the apostles as missionaries. What can you say about how they were missionaries?
Yeah, so that's great. I love the different stages of the church's missionary activity and thinking about that historically and theologically. There's a really great book by Stephen Bevins and Roger Schrader called Constance in Context. And in fact, they actually take a similar approach to sort of look at these different ages of the church's missionary activity and kind of ask the question, what context was the church engaging and how was it then kind of adjusting its practices in order to really bring about the fullness of the gospel, to instantiate the fullness of the gospel, to spread, to share the fullness of the gospel, to live the fullness of the gospel. And I think you talk about the apostolic age, the age of the disciples. I think people were really witnessing and looking at Jesus as an example of how they should be living their lives. So they would look at, for instance, how Jesus was attending to the poor, how he was casting out demons, how he was also not just acting, but then also sharing. What does it mean for us to be human beings? What does it mean for us to love God? Who is God? How should we respond to God? And so in this very early stages, already you see the disciples like kind of asking that question, and Jesus inviting them to think about what does it mean for them as kind of like the nascent church to be followers of Jesus? A very basic question. And they're reflecting on that. And one of the things which is clear from our tradition is that they understood that following Jesus required them to carry Jesus's message to the world. So you have Jesus's words in Matthew's gospel that, to go to the nations. You then see the early church kind of wrestling with this. Is what Jesus brought simply for the Jewish people, or is it for the nations? Is it to the nations, ad gentes, as we would come to hear in the document in Vatican II? So the church was wrestling with that, and it was really, in a sense, it was all about kind of building relationships and then working in these small Christian communities that oftentimes took place in people's homes. And so that's really an interesting thing, right? So you have St. Paul as kind of like the perfect example. He's going to these different cities. Sometimes he works just to establish himself. He says he's a tent maker. He establishes himself in these cities. He's building relationships with some prominent people, also speaking with those who are perhaps, sort of poorer or lesser in society. But he starts these little communities. They are meeting at house churches. They're eating together. They're celebrating how they understood the Eucharist to be celebrated at that time. And then Paul would move on and go to another place. And then that local community would essentially try to continue to cultivate the faith, cultivate the experience of being disciples. And so that was kind of the small ways that the church, I think, continued to develop in that apostolic age. I could speak a little bit about maybe the next stage if you would want, Father Matthew, but.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if there were one or two of the other stages we can talk about, because we can't really go in depth in every single stage, but which ones do you think would be the most valuable for the listeners to hear about?
Yeah, that's great. So I think you have these stages of mission are oftentimes defined by the saints of those periods. So you might say the next stage was one of really a time of almost 1,000 years of monasticism. So you have here like desert monasticism. So desert fathers, desert mothers. You have Benedictine monasticism. And I think part of what the church is trying to do there is it's wrestling with a lot of like political, cultural changes. Or so you have the church in a post-Constantine reality. What does it mean when, in a sense, Christianity becomes more or less like an accepted, religion within the empire? But many people don't really know a whole lot about Christianity in many ways, right? So it's one thing for it just to say like this is going to happen, but it's another for people to appropriate that message. So like the monastics, I think were interested in building local communities and structuring their lives around, prayer and work, which of course is like the traditional kind of Benedictine way of seeing it. But they were trying to say that sometimes being in the world has a tendency to, one, be kind of dangerous. Also, two, perhaps be even like dangerous for the soul or for the living out of discipleship. So we wanted to be very intentional about entering into and engaging in this way. So they built up monasteries, and those monasteries were super helpful in terms of, passing on the faith, copying out the scriptures. And also, I would say, cultivating like a deep sense of a preservation of culture, education, and learning. And so that was really kind of 1,000 years. And then I would say we have then the rise of the mendicants. And so you have like St. Dominic, St. Francis, and this was an adjustment, kind of like you might say going slightly outside of the monastery, if you will. Again, this is not a perfect capture of what was happening, but go outside and then to kind of live in and among the people, to beg, to kind of live this sort of pretty extreme sense of evangelical poverty, but to be able to then share the gospel where people are in the present context of what we might consider to be a kind of more European-centered church at this time. And then the final thing I'll say, which I think sets us up well for a conversation perhaps of Vatican II, is Then you have this period from like, let's say the 1400s, really even into like the 20th century, where now a kind of, not exclusively, I want to be careful here, but a kind of more kind of Eurocentric ecclesial reality of the church begins, because of a number of economic and sociological changes, begins to see and think about these quote unquote undiscovered areas, at least to the European mindset, all of these places that perhaps the gospel has never been brought to. And people are like, oh my gosh, we really need to take up Jesus's invitation to bring this gospel to all the nations. And so you have people setting out on the seas. You have people traveling long distances. And this could only have been made possible because of technological changes, with travel, with shipping, with roads and things like that. And so you have this kind of confluence of, people pursuing economic benefit. You have certain kind of nations or let's say monarchies pursuing wealth and power. So you have colonialism mixed in with economic pursuits, mixed in with like this missionary spirit, which is to say, well, we should get on these ships and we should go to these places where people have never heard the gospel before. Well, that's like a 300 to 500 year period of time. And there's a lot of lessons that are learned by the church. There are mistakes as well. As we know, there is sometimes an inability for folks to have seen the dignity of the people that they were encountering or to preserve that dignity. But nevertheless, like missionary activity is always pretty messy. It's like, it's always lived like in the present moment. You're trying to think creatively. You're trying to reflect, but nevertheless, you're encountering these new realities and you have to adjust, just as we have to adjust today. And so that mentality that we are missionary by going to places that are the missions, and that the gospel truly has never been shared before. Not that God hasn't been present, but that the fullness of the gospel has never been shared. The church has never been planted there. That really brings us up to the mentality of the 20th century, setting the groundwork for further reflection on mission, which takes place at Vatican II.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I can think of people like Mother Teresa who went to India, or I have a priest friend whose sister is a sister. I don't know if she's doing some kind of missions out in like Indonesia, Malaysia area. I forget exactly. I remember he was saying he was going out to visit his sister there who was like, and I forget exactly which country it was, somewhere out in that area. So one of the things that I thought was interesting, one of the reasons I wanted to interview somebody like yourself was your organization, your community, Glenmary, does missions in the United States, which I think a lot of people are surprised with. I know we're recording this in the morning, and I was sitting at breakfast with a priest who's, I think, from Mexico. He's definitely from Latin America, a native Spanish speaker. And he was kind of surprised that there was like a community that was dedicated to missions in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about what Glenmary does and how they kind of fit into this?
Yeah, so I'm really passionate about this, obviously. So I'm super happy for the opportunity to say a couple of words. So I think there's a helpful theological distinction that can be made here, and we find this in Vatican II. And the first is that, the church comes to understand herself in a more explicit way through Vatican II, that all people are called to be missionary, and that the nature of the church is missionary, so that everything the church is about should be about mission. So that's great, and we can talk more about that. And then the church is always held up, well, almost always, let's say, I think probably always, that there are areas that we would consider to be called like mission territories. So the Vatican has a way of talking about mission dioceses. But for Glenmary, we recognized, or our founder recognized back in the early 20th century, that in the United States, during our founder, Father William Howard Bishop was his name. He wasn't a bishop, but he's a diocesan priest from Baltimore. He looked at a map of the United States, and imagine this. In the 1930s, there were 1,000 counties where there was no resident priest, no parish, no Catholic Eucharistic presence. That is a massive territory. And primarily, that territory was in what we would call today Appalachia and the south and the southeast of the United States. And that has to do with the routes of migration for many Catholics. So the Northeast was always pretty strongly Catholic. The Southwest, obviously, because of the missionary activity. And then even the Midwest, because of the Germans and other influence, there was Catholicism. But those 1,000 counties existed primarily in the South and the Southeast and Appalachia, mostly rural areas. So our founder said, look, in the early 20th century, American Catholicism was coming in itself, right? It was coming of age in a sense, because it was now sending missionaries all over the world. Places like China, around the continent of Africa, Latin and South America. It was great. But Father Bishop, our founder, said, okay, wonderful, but who will send priests and brothers and missionaries to these counties where people have never heard of the gifts of the Catholic Church and where people have no access to those gifts? So Father Bishop founded Glenmary, and for now, moving into 100 years, Glenmary's exclusive mission is to go to rural counties where the Catholic Church has never been established, or perhaps is not fully established, where the Catholic population is less than 0.5% of the total population, and where sometimes up to 60% of the population is quote unquote unchurched. So we go to these counties to live with the people that are there, to do what we call a ministry of presence, as well as proclamation, evangelization. We build relationships with non-Catholic Christians, and we hope to establish a vibrant parish so as to offer the gifts of the Catholic Church to the people of that area and uplift the lives of the poor, going to the peripheries, and then at some point turn those missions over to the diocese, and like St. Paul, move on to a different location and do the same thing again.
Oh, yeah. Like less than 0.5% is very low. I remember I was in, I think it was Lexington about 10, 15 years ago, Diocese of Lexington. One of the priests was telling me that outside the city, outside the city and metro area, the Catholic percent of Lexington was like 2 or 3%. And 0.5% is like a whole significantly even lower than that. And Lexington, I assume Lexington would be at least the eastern part of the Diocese of Lexington, which would be in Appalachia for sure by any normal definition of those terms. So now we're going to move on to Ad Gentes. There's a few key themes. We're going to touch on them briefly. You kind of brought in the first one, which is being missionary as part of the nature of the church, coming from the Trinity and things like that. So do you want to expand a little bit on how being missionary is part of the nature of the church?
Yeah, that's great. That's a wonderful question. And maybe just to back up a bit, I wrote an article on what was pre-conciliar mission theology, and that article is called "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants?" And it really is revisiting Ad Gentes and Vatican II's mission theology in light of pre-conciliar. So basically, maybe the first 60 years before the council, like the theology of mission. And I won't get into all the details of that, but I would refer people to that. It was published by Irish Theological Quarterly. And I would just say that I think when it comes to the church's theology of mission, it's always a matter of saying, well, sometimes we start to emphasize things in a deeper way or a more pronounced way, or focus on specific areas. But it's always building on something that has come to us from the past. And sometimes maybe we forget to highlight certain aspects of the church's mission theology, and we need to bring it to the forefront. I say all of that to say that it's not like Vatican II and Ad Gentes just dropped out of nowhere. The church was, in a nascent way or in an inchoate way, beginning to think more systematically about mission theology in the early part of the 20th century. And I just think it's important to hold that up. So first and foremost, like when you talk about theological underpinnings or principles for mission, we're talking about like what in our tradition provides us a foundation on which to stand so that we can engage in mission. And one of the things that we find is that Jesus's commandment, go to the nations, be my witnesses, go therefore, proclaim the gospel. Like this has always been like in the forefront of the church's reflection. And that is in the document of Ad Gentes in Vatican II. And we should cultivate that in our own lives, I think, as disciples of Jesus. But the church then begins to reflect on what we might call a more theologically robust understanding of where we found our missionary activity. And the church says, yes, the mandate of Jesus is very important, and we never want to lose sight of that. But we also can look at the very nature of God in himself and realize that God is actually missionary in a sense. Why? Because God sends his son, missio, right? The son is sent in order to bring about salvation and an opportunity for salvation. And even as the son is sent, once he completes his missionary work, let's say, and then ascends to the Father and the Son send the Spirit to enliven the church, who is then sent forth to continue on, in a sense, the mission of the loving God, who is a Trinitarian God. And so that is the kind of the most robust, I would say, theological articulation of the foundations of mission found in Gentes, and that comes right really in the very beginning of this missionary document. As we say, the church is missionary by our very nature, and Gentes too. Why? Because it is caught up in the love of the Trinity, where the Father sends the Son and the Father send the Spirit. It enlivens us as a church, and then we are sent out into the world to continue on the saving work of God. So that's kind of that beautiful theological underpinning that we find right in the beginning of Gentes.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think you covered one of the themes I was going to come up here, the missionary call. I think you kind of covered that. But the second theme I had kind of links back to what you were talking about, the Glenmary missionaries having that mission that you sort of called the ministry of presence, because it talks here about witness and community as forms of evangelization. And how does Vatican II talk about those aspects of evangelization, not just the preaching of the word?
Yeah, this is great. So we sometimes will talk about the foundations of mission, and then we kind of talk about like there's a dual consideration here, like the goal, like what are the goals, the multifaceted goals of mission, and then what's the nature of mission, like how is it lived out, and just to maybe kind of highlight a couple of the goals of mission. Two primary themes existed in the preconciliar theological reflection on mission, and then were brought up. And when you're reading Gentes, you're going to hear both of these themes held up as goals of mission. The first is the church always said one of the primary goals of mission is to plant the church. So they talk about plantatio ecclesiae. And what they mean there is kind of what Glenmary is involved in. Like, in order to do missionary work, the structures of the church are really important. And I think if you come from a heavily Catholic area, we might just assume the structures of the church have always been there, but they haven't. And so, and what I mean by structures here is a diocese that functions, parishes, the regular celebration of the sacraments, clergy, vibrant religious communities, lay people, living their life in a vibrant way of Catholicism, and then the structures of the church affecting the broader culture. So the church has always said, yes, to do our missionary work, we need to plant the church, and that church needs to be vibrant. And then so the question is, well, then why do we do that? And the second theme, which is one of those goals of mission, is what we would call salus animarum, or the salvation of souls. So what is the reason for our missionary activity? What's the reason for the church existing? Well, it is truly to bring about the salvation of souls. Why? Because this is Christ's desire, it's Christ's work. And so as we're going about planting the church, we're trying to invite people to have an opportunity to experience the fullness of salvation. We'll have to nuance, what salvation looks like, what's considered, in this whole idea of salvation. We would talk about integral salvation or holistic salvation today. But nevertheless, never to lose sight of the fact that, like Jesus came to bring life and to bring it to the full. And when we talk about fullness of life, we mean salvation, the fullness of life here, but also the eternal destination of our souls. And that is an extremely important thing for us to keep in mind as the goals of the church's missionary activity.
Excellent. Let's just move on to the outline of Gentes. It has 6 chapters. And as we're going to read all the text of these chapters in the podcast later on, I'm just looking for a short summary for each one, maybe, 2-3 sentences or something like that. So the first chapter is Principles of Doctrine. What can we expect in that chapter?
So you're going to be reading around the theological foundations of why we engage in mission. So you're going to get the mandate of Jesus. You're also going to get important reflections on the Trinitarian foundations of mission. But we're going to look deeply into the tradition and say, oh yeah, so this is why the church is missionary.
Excellent. And the second chapter is mission work itself. What will our listeners expect in that?
Yeah, this is also really, really rich writing with the council. Again, this looks at a little bit the goals of mission, as I've alluded to, the planting of the church, the seeking the salvation of souls. But it also talks about, like, what does it mean for us just simply to be witnesses? What does it mean for me to grow in holiness? It talks a little bit in there about, like, the importance of explicitly preaching the gospel, gathering the community. I think a lot about Glenmary here. Part of our work is just gathering that small community together. And then how do you enrich the local community so that the local community itself is engaging in this missionary task of the church?
Excellent. Our third chapter is particular churches. And just for our audience's understanding, particular usually here, we can almost translate it as like local, because it's talking about, the church in a local area when they say particular churches. But what else can we say about this chapter?
It's really great. So this, we should keep in mind now, is the church's desire to establish a fully functioning diocese in every geographical area of the world. And that's what we mean by particular church. It's really a diocesan reality. Now, some dioceses today, I think there's like 1,000 throughout the world, but there are 70 in the United States, if I get my numbers correct here. I think that's the case. Some dioceses are typically referred to as mission dioceses. And so what Gentes is concerned about here is, how do we bring these places that don't have, let's say, an established diocese or then have a mission diocese, how do we bring them to a place of full flourishing? And so there is a lot of conversation here about what that looks like. Particularly, I would say an important consideration here is a diocese is growing to the place of good development, let's say, when it itself is now sending missionaries to other places throughout the world. And so we might talk about from mission to mission, right? So from a mission diocese to then being kind of missioner in itself, sending people to other contexts where perhaps Christianity is struggling or perhaps it's never been shared before.
Oh yeah, definitely. I know that from my own community, Lead Church of Christ, we're given what was the mission territory of Chetumal. It was prelature, and it recently, like a few years ago, was elevated. For those who don't know, Chetumal has become the Diocese of Cancun. Cancun was like, when we arrived back 50, 60 years ago, Cancun was a little tiny fishing village with like 200 people in it. Wow. So it was definitely not the Cancun you all think about when you hear the word Cancun. And so my community has been the missionaries there for a while. And a lot of it is reaching out, especially once you go a little outside Cancun. There's a lot of people who still speak Mayan, for example, and not even Spanish, which is in the rural areas. So those kind of things you have to establish, and that is the example. We went from a prelature to a full-fledged diocese only like 5 years ago for Cancun. So moving on to chapter 4, we're talking about missionaries. So what can we say about that, Father Aaron?
Yeah, so this is, I would say, two things to look for here. There's, first of all, the church continues to emphasize that there will be specific people who have a what we might call, quote unquote, missionary vocation. And that would be people like, let's say, in Glenmary, but there would be other religious orders, and even in a sense, lay people, and as well as priests who would say, yeah, we have a specifically missionary vocation. And again, this is kind of to go to those places where the gospel has never been preached in full and the church is not fully established. And that's great. And it's really important. And these people need to be trained. They need to be trained in many different ways. That's why we talk about the training in missiology. They need to be trained in the cultural context, the languages of the people that they're going to serve. They need to be trained in the dominant, let's say, religions that are in those areas to know about them. And that's wonderful. And you also then hear in this whole conversation around missionaries, this whole idea that even as there's a specific missionary vocation, we're all called to be missionaries. And the church, even up to this present time, will continue to then hold up this idea that everybody's called to be a missionary disciple. And so that might mean like I might work at Procter & Gamble, but I'm nevertheless called by God to engage in a certain kind of missionary activity in the workplace. Or my missionary activity might be my family. And let's not like downplay the importance of that. The importance of parents, a missionary vocation for parents is to find the best way to pass on the faith to their children. Like this is a way to propagate the faith, to use that kind of that older phrase. My missionary activity might be that I'm called to be a politician. Okay. So how does that translate for me to be a faithful disciple of Jesus now engaging in the political sphere? Now, these are super complicated questions, but the church in this chapter is holding up these different kinds of missionaries in the church.
Yeah, definitely. The idea of mission in the family or mission in the workplace, like P&G you mentioned, is really also in the document of the Lay Apostolate, Apostolical Maximum. And I was actually recording some of the episodes for that yesterday, so that came to mind right away. The last two chapters, chapter 5 is on planning missionary activity and chapter 6 on cooperation. Could you give us a little bit on those two chapters?
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad you put both of these together, because as I was reviewing it, I'm like, yeah, these go very well together. The first thing I would highlight with the planning, and this is really important. The Catholic Church is so amazing in that it is truly a universal reality, and we actually, as a worldwide institution, try to cooperate. We cooperate by the fact that there are certain dicasteries in the Vatican that oversee the missionary activity of the church throughout the entire world. And it is really important for bishops to then coordinate within these particular areas, especially their dioceses, the missionary activity which exists there. Now, I'll just give you a great example of this. Glenmary will study maps of where we see missionary activity needed, let's just say in the Diocese of Knoxville. So maybe 10, 12 years ago, my first assignment as a priest was in our newest missions in East Tennessee in the Knoxville Diocese. Well, what we did was we contacted the bishop of the Diocese of Knoxville, and we said, we see these few counties here. We are asking your permission to do missionary work in these counties. And it is the purview of the bishop to say yes or no, because he is ultimately the one who is he's like the head missioner of the diocese, and he's responsible for the souls in those counties or those places where the Catholic Church has never been fully present. So bishops, of course, are usually very, very excited to hear from Glenmary, and I'm sure from your community as well. They say, oh, we would like to pursue missionary activity in this place. They really invite us because they're responsible for the planning and organization, not in just the areas where Catholicism is underdeveloped, but again, the coordination of Catholicism throughout the entire diocese. And then the final thing would be to say, in terms of cooperation, and I like this invitation. Again, it's sort of like going back to the early church, and maybe this provides a nice thread between the beginning of our conversation and now. Even in the early church, the early communities who had, say, more means or more wealth, they were invited to support places, parts of the church that were struggling financially, with their prayers, perhaps even sending missioners to those places. Well, we are called to continue to do that today. So even as we live out our missionary discipleship, maybe in the workplace, in our families, we're called to pray for those quote unquote mission areas. We're called to perhaps raise up children who consider a missionary vocation. We're called to send money to help the missions as much as we can. And so there's a broad sense of cooperation and mission that all of us in our discipleship are involved in. But then there's a specific thought from Gentes that, we need to be thinking as as lay people, as diocesan priests, as religious brothers and sisters who maybe aren't working in the missions, how can we support the missions? And I'll just give you one final example. Throughout the summer, you probably all do this as well, but we get invitations to go into dioceses to actually talk about Glenmary's mission and ministry and then ask for financial help. This is extremely important. Why? Because the areas where Glenmary serves are so poor and the parishes are so poor that we staff that they don't have enough money to even keep the lights on, let alone conduct all of the necessary aspects of mission. So we travel throughout the United States. We talk about Glenmary's mission, and people out of their generosity, they pray for us, they take our material, and they oftentimes will contribute to us financially. We can't exist in Glenmary without people's willingness to support the missions in that sense.
Yeah, I know we did that a lot when for Cancun and the mission down in Latin America in Yucatan Peninsula there when that was still a mission territory. Now this is established diocese, and a lot of our work in the U.S. is more in the cities, and we do have people who are connected to our work in the cities where we are financially, at least with our American work, financially more or less self-sufficient with donations in the local areas. And we run schools private schools that have tuition and that pays the bills, that pays a decent portion of the bills and things like that. So, but I definitely know of the mission coming and people donating money. I think that's a great way people can contribute. Moving on to after Vatican II, I think there were 3 documents, encyclicals or similar, written by the Pope since then. I just want to mention all 3 and then just get a little what you would think that they add to it. So the first one is Evangelii Nuntiandi, the Announcement of Gospel, in 1975 by Paul VI. What can you say about that document?
Yeah, it's a great document on mission. And I'd say it does a couple of things. First of all, Paul VI, following this gathering and this conversation, what he does is the church affirms the missionary drive of Vatican II. And that is super important because it's to say that there was a wonderful thing that happened in Vatican II, and we need to affirm it. In addition to what takes place at Vatican II, I would say one thing that is highlighted is this whole sense of liberation. And so going on in that period of time were reflections on liberation theology, and many of those were very fruitful. Some of those were a little bit problematic, let's say. But what Paul VI is saying along with this document is that when the church engages in either planting the church or missionary activity or the salvation of souls, we are thinking about liberation in the broadest sense of that word. And so what is included here is a reflection on what I call and what Glenmary calls in the church, I think calls too, social transformation. So even as we're concerned about people's ultimate resting place, that is eternity spent in heaven with our loving God, we're also thinking about liberating people from oppression in the world around them. And the church has to be concerned of the cries of the poor. The church has to work to bring about justice as much as we are able with the cooperation of God's grace. And so I think that social transformation is held up by Paul VI in a really important way in Evangelii Nuntiandi.
Excellent. The second one I want to note is John Paul II's encyclical Redemptoris Missio, the Mission of the Redeemer, in 1990. It has a subtitle that's quite descriptive on the permanent validity of the church's missionary mandate. What do you think that it added to the idea of mission in the understanding of the church?
So it's interesting. The church, I think, like our theologians and the leaders of the church, and particularly the Pope, is always they're always reflecting on kind of what we might call getting a sense. We might say today a sense of the vibes of what is happening within the church. And I think one of what I would consider to be somewhat negative tendencies of how some people interpreted the documents of the Second Vatican Council, it would be that there was kind of a less of an importance placed on the centrality, what we would call the universality and the unicity of Jesus, the uniqueness of Jesus as the Savior of all of creation. And so one can understand it's quite complex, and we don't have to get into the weeds here, but one can understand, like, so you say, well, like, what's the value of other religions? And how does that relate to the saving work of Jesus? What is the role of the Holy Spirit? What is the role of culture? What is the role of non-Christian or non-Catholic Christian denominations? So basically what is happening in Redemptoris Missio is that John Paul II is saying we absolutely essentially need to continue to engage in missionary activity. What do we offer to the world? We offer Jesus. We offer Jesus through his church, so through the abundance of the sacraments that Christ works in and through. But we offer this invitation for people to have the fullness of life, which we believe comes in and through Jesus himself and living out that life of the church. Now, that's not to say that there are not positive aspects in other religions of the world. We talk about them being seeds of the word or preparation for the gospel. That's not to say that the Holy Spirit is not working in places where maybe the church is not fully established, or people maybe don't have access to the fullness of the Catholic Church. All of that is a wonderful thing. It's not to say that in cultures, the Spirit can bring about wisdom and virtue within cultures that have never been maybe even touched explicitly by Christianity. All that John Paul II wants to do is to say all of that is good, but we still need to proclaim the fullness of what we believe we have to offer to people, and that is life in Jesus Christ. Salvation through Jesus Christ, which comes through the church. And that was a great thing. And I would just add finally to this, I would argue that one of the other important documents, which maybe wouldn't be mentioned here, but I think is really helpful, is the document Dominus Jesus, which comes out in 2010. And for your listeners who are perhaps more interested in some of the theological particularities, to read Dominus Jesus, probably written by Cardinal Ratzinger. But this is, again, a very specific articulation of how the church and salvation through Christ relates to these other areas that I was mentioning there. And I just think it's a really, really helpful document.
Yeah, definitely. Dominus Jesus was one that just kind of like slipped out of my list here. For the listeners, I think you intended, but it's written in 2000. I think you said 2010 by accident, but I I entered religious life in 2001. I remember reading it before I entered. So I'm very clear it's not 2010. But anyway, so our last document is Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel, which Pope Francis wrote in 2013 as one of his first documents as Pope. And its subtitle also helps us. It's on the proclamation of the gospel in today's world. What do you think that Francis adds to what we've gotten in Vatican II, John Paul II, etc.?
Yeah, great. So, thank you for that. Dominus Jesus in 2000. I appreciate that clarification. And I think a couple things with Pope Francis. I think you could say he's continuing this long reflection on kind of a post-Vatican II reflection on the mission of the church. And I would say there are really three things which I think are important. The first is, and we haven't touched on this explicitly, but there are references to this kind of idea, which we might call at large the sense of the new evangelization. And that was a reflection that came about starting with John Paul II and then kind of carried forward, I believe. And that is just simply the recognition that there are some contexts in the world where they were the heart of Catholicism, let's say, and now through a process of many, many different factors, we might call this at large secularism, but it's just very complicated. The faith is not lived there as vibrantly. And in fact, in some ways, it has regressed. And so there needs to be kind of like new efforts, new ardor, new spirit, new attempts to then bring the faith in its fullness, kind of, in a sense, quote unquote, back to these places. Okay, so that's a theme which is carried out. So what does that look like? Well, Francis, I really think this is a great, great topic of his, and this was part of his pontificate. So Pope Francis would talk about la periferia, or the peripheries, right? So talking about the existential peripheries, talking about wherever the most marginalized people are in a context, that's where the church should be focusing for a couple of reasons. One, because that was the invitation by Jesus, right? Whatever you did to the least of these, you've done for me. And also, I think Francis was onto something. The more the church can serve these peripheries, these marginalized places, these difficult situations, the more she's being, genuine to her calling. But then people will see that. And that actually serves as a great, great witness to what the church is about. And that is a process of not just evangelization, but perhaps re-evangelization or new evangelization. And then the final thing I think that Pope Francis emphasizes is that he holds up the importance of a kind of merciful approach to the world. And more could be said on this, but I think it's important for us to think about, like, what is our stance toward the non-believing world around us? Is it one of condemnation? Is it one of critique? Is it one of hostility? Or I think Francis would want us to say it should be at least in part an approach of mercy. And I think right with that, it would be recognizing that many times the situations people find themselves in, they didn't overtly choose them. It might be a situation of like a terrible family experience. Maybe they never had the opportunity to go to church in their whole life. Maybe they were, quote unquote, indoctrinated with kind of false or problematic ideologies. Francis, I think, says, well, think about, if that was me, would I be any different than them? And so we take this stance of wanting to bring about reconciliation, healing, but simply this deep sense of love, kind of like, the openness of the Father to the prodigal son. And I think that sense of mercy is really important. It doesn't mean that the church cannot be prophetic. The church has to be prophetic. The church at times has to stand up to injustice, stand up to evil doctrines, let's say, hateful doctrines. But in the midst of that, recognizing that when we're working with individuals, to be as merciful as we possibly can, that to extend the mercy of the Father through the Son and the Spirit to the person that is in front of me, recognizing that life is difficult and tough, but God loves them still no matter where they find themselves that day.
Oh, excellent. I think that's a good conclusion, to remember that God loves everyone no matter where they are. Just before we conclude, I want to give you the opportunity to invite our listeners to something you or Glenmary is involved in. If there's something that you think they might want to read or something they might want to do to know about the missions or do more about the missions, what can you offer the listeners?
Yeah, so I think probably the two most important things maybe to say at this point, one would be to visit Glenmary's website, which is glenmary.org. So GLENMARY.org. You're going to find videos, more information about our particular ministry, which I think, might be interesting to people. And then I would say the second thing is, if you want to read more about the tools and the skills and some of the theology around how we might live as missionaries today, I do recommend my book, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World. You can find that on Amazon or wherever else you buy your books. And I think that's a particularly important book simply because we do live in a hyper toxically polarized culture in the United States today. It is a very relevant issue. It touches people's lives. It touches parishes. And I've heard from people, so I'm not kind of just, kind of self-proclaiming my work here, but people have said that the book has been very helpful for them with their relationships in their family, in their parishes, across the partisan, maybe political divide. So I just recommend that book, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World.
Excellent. And we'll put the link to glenmary.org and also to your book on Amazon in the show notes so people can follow up if they're interested in either of those. Thank you for being with us, Father Aaron. Just before I conclude today, I want to make a brief call out to Father Rich Conlon and his blog, Prodigal Catholic. When I prepared these interviews for different ones, a few times I've used them as a resource for summaries of Vatican II documents. I'll include a link to his blog in the show notes as well. I did use it partially today to kind of go over and review, make sure I didn't miss anything when I was talking about the themes and such. So thank you all for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we're going to start reading Ad Gentes, and that begins with paragraph 1 on the Church is for all people. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information, on the podcast, like playlists for individual documents and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X.